A woman may lose a ring in a room full of witnesses and still keep the only thing that matters. The thought came to Amelia Whitmore as every candle in Caldwell House seemed to burn too brightly, exposing the pallor of her face, the trembling of her gloved fingers, and the silver tray waiting between her and the man who had promised, only 6 weeks ago, that he would protect her name. Rain struck the tall windows of the drawing-room with a steady, patient cruelty, each drop sliding down the glass like something that had given up resisting gravity. Around her, the guests sat in a polished half-circle of silk, velvet, black coats, pearl pins, and practiced concern, their eyes lowered just enough to pretend kindness and lifted just enough to enjoy disgrace. Lord Henry Caldwell stood near the marble fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as if the entire house had been built to support his composure. He was handsome in the easy way of men who had never been denied warmth, with pale hair neatly combed, a white cravat perfectly tied, and a mouth that had learned how to wound without losing its shape. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the room seemed to tighten around her name. "It has become clear that certain matters concerning your family's financial condition were not represented with full honesty." Amelia heard Mrs. Caldwell draw a soft breath behind her fan. She heard a teacup touch its saucer. She heard, from somewhere outside, the low roll of thunder moving over the Vermont hills. What she did not hear was surprise. Not from Henry. Not from his mother. Not from any of the smiling people who had been invited to witness an engagement dinner and had instead been offered a sacrifice. "My family has hidden nothing," Amelia replied, her voice quiet enough that those nearest leaned forward, and steady enough that they were disappointed. Henry's eyes flickered, only once. "Nevertheless, the Caldwell name cannot be bound to uncertainty. I regret the necessity, but the engagement must be dissolved." A silence followed, clean and sharp as frost on a windowpane. Amelia felt the ring on her finger before she looked at it. A gold band, set with a small blue stone, chosen not for love but for appearance, not for tenderness but for agreement. It had been placed on her hand in the garden under a mild September sun while Henry spoke of duty, alliance, and a future that sounded less like marriage than a contract read aloud by candlelight. She had accepted it because Whitmore House had cracks in its walls, because her mother's medicine cost more each month, because her younger sister had begun pretending she was not hungry before supper. She had accepted it because sometimes a woman did not walk toward happiness. Sometimes she walked toward shelter and prayed not to be despised for needing a roof. Now Henry was taking even that from her, and doing it before witnesses so he could call his cowardice principle. Amelia lowered her gaze. Her thumb moved beneath the ring. For one terrible second, it would not pass over the knuckle, and the smallest murmur stirred through the room. She breathed in. Slowly. Once. Then the ring slipped free. She held it in her palm, where it looked suddenly smaller than the ruin it had caused. Mrs. Caldwell's butler stepped forward with the silver tray, his face arranged into professional sorrow. Amelia placed the ring upon it. The faint sound it made against the metal was softer than a bell and somehow final enough to bury a season of her life. "Then I return," she said, lifting her eyes to Henry, "what was never truly mine." No one moved. Henry's jaw tightened, but he gave a slight bow, as though he had won something noble. Amelia curtsied to his mother, to the room, to every cruelly attentive face that would repeat the scene by morning with embellishments. Then she turned toward the doors. Near the far wall, Duke Everett Hawthorne stood apart from the others, tall and severe in black, his silver-handled cane resting beneath one gloved hand. He had said almost nothing all evening. Yet as Amelia passed, she felt the weight of his gaze, not greedy with gossip, not soft with pity, but grave, as if he had recognized the sound of something breaking because it echoed an older fracture in himself. She did not look back. Pride carried her through the hall. Pride placed her hand on the latch. Pride opened the door too. The night. Cold rain rushed over her face, her hair, her thin cloak, and the stone steps beneath her shoes. Behind her, Caldwell House glowed with golden windows and closed hearts. Before her, the road vanished into darkness. Amelia stepped down into the storm, alone, silent, and unclaimed. The rain took the shape of 1,000 small judgments as Amelia descended the steps of Caldwell House, each drop striking her bonnet, her cheeks, the worn seams of her cloak, as if the sky itself had joined the room behind her in asking how much humiliation one woman could carry without bending. The gravel drive stretched ahead in a pale ribbon of mud and silver water, curving past clipped hedges, stone urns, and the iron gates that separated the Caldwell estate from the poorer road leading back toward Bellwether. She had no carriage waiting. Of course she did not. Henry had sent hers away before dinner under the polite pretense that his driver would see her home afterward, and now that promise, like all his others, had dissolved into the storm. Behind her, through the high windows, she could still see the blurred movement of guests inside the drawing room. A fan lifted. A shoulder turned. A pale face leaned toward another, eager to begin the story before Amelia had even crossed the lawn. By morning, they would say she had come into the Caldwell family with debts hidden beneath her gloves. They would say Henry had behaved with admirable restraint. They would say Miss Whitmore had taken the rejection poorly, even if all she had done was return a ring and walk out before her heart could betray her. She kept her back straight until she reached the first bend in the drive. Only then did her breath falter. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just one broken inhale that disappeared beneath the rain. She pressed one hand against her ribs, where the ache had gathered like a hand closing from the inside. Whitmore House waited nearly 4 miles away, at the edge of town, with its leaking roof, its tired shutters, and its windows that glowed too dimly because coal had become a luxury measured by the hour. Her mother would be awake, pretending not to worry. Her sister, Lily, would be watching. The road from the upstairs window, wrapped in a quilt and hope. Amelia had left that afternoon with a ring on her hand and a future, however loveless, in her pocket. She was returning with neither. The thought made her pause beside a row of winterbear lilacs. For a moment, the rain smelled of wet branches, cold earth, and crushed leaves underfoot. She lowered her eyes and saw the faint pale circle on her glove where the ring had rested. It seemed indecent that something so small could leave such evidence. "Do not cry here," she whispered to herself. Her voice was nearly lost in the wind. Not on their road. She began walking again, faster this time, because movement was the only form of courage still available to her. Her shoes sank into softened gravel. Water crept through the stitching and chilled her toes. Her skirt grew heavy around her ankles, pulling with each step as though the storm wished to keep her near the house that had discarded her. The iron gate stood ahead, black and narrow beneath 2 lanterns that swung violently in the wind. Beyond them lay the open road, the dark line of trees, and the long descent toward Greybrook Bridge. She had just reached the gate when the sound came from behind her. Wheels. Slow at first. Then steadier. Amelia stopped, every muscle in her body tightening. For one wild instant she thought Henry had changed his mind, not from love, but from fear of appearing cruel. The idea filled her with such immediate shame that she almost stepped into the ditch to hide from it. She did not want his regret. She did not want his apology, if apology was only another way for him to remain noble in the eyes of those who mattered. The carriage lamps emerged through the rain like 2 dim stars swallowed by mist. It was not the Caldwell carriage. It was black, lacquered, severe, with no crest painted brightly on the door, only a small silver hawthorn branch worked into the paneling. Duke Everett Hawthorne's carriage. Amelia turned away before it reached her. Her face burned despite the cold. Of all the witnesses inside that room, why did it have to be him? Why did the one man whose silence had felt least cruel have to see her now? Soaked, abandoned, and walking home like a servant dismissed after dark? The carriage slowed beside her, its wheels hissing through the mud. She did not look. She fixed her gaze on the road beyond the gate and forced herself forward. Inside the carriage, Everett Hawthorne sat rigid beneath the shadowed roof, his gloved hand closed around the silver head of his cane. Rain streaked the window between them, turning Amelia's figure into something fragile and indistinct, yet he saw enough. The wet cloak clinging to her shoulders. The careful lift of her chin. The refusal to run. Across from him, his driver's muffled voice called back through the hatch, "Your Grace, shall I offer the lady a ride?" Everett watched Amelia step beyond the gate into the darker road, alone beneath a storm thick enough to blind a man at 50 feet. A memory stirred before he could stop it, another woman, another storm, another carriage that had arrived too late to matter. His jaw tightened. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Follow at a distance." The driver hesitated only a second before the reins shifted. The carriage moved again, slowly, respectfully, keeping far enough behind that Amelia would not feel hunted, and close enough that the night could not claim her unseen. The road beyond Caldwell House descended into open country, where the rain no longer fell in elegant lines against polished windows but swept sideways across the fields, flattening the dead grass and blurring the stone walls into long gray scars. Amelia walked with her head lowered just enough to shield her face, though the effort was useless. Water had already found its way beneath the edge of her bonnet, down the back of her neck, through the wool of her cloak, and into the thin gloves that clung to her fingers like cold paper. Each step carried her farther from the golden rooms where her humiliation would soon be trimmed into gossip, dressed in sympathy, and passed from parlor to parlor before breakfast. She tried not to imagine Henry standing by the fireplace, accepting murmured praise for his restraint. She tried not to imagine Mrs. Caldwell telling some attentive widow that she had always sensed something unfortunate in Miss Whitmore's position. She tried hardest not to imagine the silver tray, the ring lying upon it, and the butler carrying it away as if removing a stain. Yet the image returned with every turn of the wheels behind her. The carriage was still there. She knew it without looking. Its lamps appeared and disappeared in the rain whenever the road curved, patient as a thought she could not dismiss. At first, pride kept her from acknowledging it. Then fear. Not fear of harm, for Duke Everett Hawthorne had not looked at her like a man who took pleasure in another person's helplessness. It was something more painful than fear. It was the terror of being seen after all the careful walls had fallen. She had survived the drawing room because no one in it had truly looked at her. They had looked at the failed engagement, the debts, the scandal, the entertainment. The Duke had looked at Amelia. That was harder to bear. Inside the carriage, Everett watched the narrow shape of her moving through the storm, and the silence within him grew heavier. He had left Caldwell House without offering explanation. No guest had dared ask for one. The moment Amelia vanished through the doors, the room had filled with the soft, satisfied rustle that always followed another person's ruin. Henry Caldwell had attempted a light remark, something about unfortunate necessities and unsuitable alliances. Everett had turned toward him then. The young lord's smile faded before a word was spoken. "Women like Miss Whitmore survive such disappointments," Henry had said at last, trying to reclaim the room. Everett remembered his own answer with no satisfaction. "Men like you create them." It had been quiet. It had been enough. Now the sentence felt useless, left behind in a warm room while Amelia walked through 4 miles of weather she should never have been forced to face alone. Everett shifted his cane across his knees. He was 40 years old enough to know that rescue could become insult when offered without respect. He had seen women dismissed as fragile while carrying burdens men would not touch. Miss Whitmore did not need a scene. She did not need a nobleman rushing from a carriage to make himself the hero of her misfortune. She needed distance until the road became dangerous. She needed shelter before pride became a kind of cruelty to the body. A gust of wind struck hard enough to rock the carriage on its springs. The driver slowed. "Your Grace," he called through the hatch, "Greybrook Bridge is ahead. Water is rising near the lower stones." Everett leaned forward. Through the wet glass, he saw Amelia pause at the bend where the old maple leaned over the road. Beyond it, the bridge waited in darkness, its low stone rail slick with rain. A mile farther lay Bellwether, then the road to Whitmore House, but the storm had changed the country. Ditches had become streams. Streams had become black, moving seams across the fields. Amelia pressed on. Of course she did. Everett closed his eyes for 1 second, and the old memory came unbidden, lanterns swinging in the wind, a driver shouting that the road had washed out, Rosalind's white scarf found tangled on a broken branch the next morning, clean as a surrender. He opened his eyes at once. The past had no right to command him, but it did. It always had. Amelia reached the first stones of Greybrook Bridge and gripped the rail. Her hand slipped. She steadied herself, but the effort bent her forward, and for the first time that night her posture failed. Not in drama. Not in surrender. Only in exhaustion. Everett struck the roof of the carriage once with the head of his cane. Stop. The carriage halted with a wet jolt. For a breath, he remained seated, mastering the impulse to move too quickly. Then he opened the door and stepped down into the rain. The cold met him like an accusation. Amelia heard the carriage door and turned at last. Her face was pale beneath the storm, her lashes dark with water, her dignity still standing even when her body had begun to tremble. "Your Grace," she said, and the formality nearly broke something in him. "Please return to Caldwell House." "I require nothing." Everett did not approach her. He removed his cloak and folded it once over his arm so she would not have to endure the indignity of having it placed upon her shoulders without consent. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low beneath the thunder, "I believe you." She stared at him, uncertain which wound he had touched. "About what?" "About your family hiding nothing." The rain fell between them. Amelia's mouth parted slightly, but no reply came. Everett extended the cloak, not toward her body, but toward her hand. "Keep your dignity," he said. "Take the cloak." For a moment, Amelia did not take the cloak. The bridge stones were slick beneath her shoes, the rain was running from the brim of her bonnet into her eyes, and every sensible part of her understood that warmth was being offered before pride could finish killing her. Still, her hand remained at her side. She had been taught, by poverty and society alike, that nothing from a powerful man arrived without a cost folded inside it. Henry's ring had been a promise. Henry's promise had been a trap. She looked at Duke Everett Hawthorne standing a few feet away in the storm, his dark coat already wet across the shoulders, his expression severe but not impatient. He did not step closer. He did not soften his voice into pity. He simply held out the cloak as though it were not rescue, but an object she had every right to accept or refuse. That restraint, more than kindness, moved her. Amelia reached for it. Their gloves did not touch. He released the garment the instant her fingers closed on the wool. It was heavy, lined, and warm from his carriage, carrying the faint scent of cedar, rain, and smoke. She drew it around herself with hands that refused to stop trembling. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt too small for what they covered. Everett inclined his head. "Greybrook is no road for walking tonight. I have walked worse roads." "I do not doubt it." His answer was so immediate that she looked up. Most men would have corrected her, dismissed her, or told her that she was too delicate to understand hardship. Everett did none of those things. He glanced toward the bridge, where water rushed beneath the arch in a dark, swollen current, then back to her face. But having survived worse is not an argument for enduring more. The sentence struck quietly, and because it was quiet, it found its way past the armor she had used in the Caldwell drawing room. Amelia turned toward the far side of the bridge. "Whitmore House is less than 4 miles from here. In clear weather. My mother will be waiting." "Then let us send word to her." The practicality of it unsettled her. She had expected command, perhaps persuasion, perhaps the cold authority of a duke accustomed to obedience. Instead, he offered a solution that included the people she loved, as if her obligations were not inconveniences to be brushed aside. A shiver passed through her before she could hide it. Everett saw it, but again he did not comment. He looked over his shoulder toward the driver. "Mr. Cole, ride to Whitmore House as soon as the lower road allows. Tell Mrs. Whitmore that her daughter is safe and will return when the storm has passed. If the road is blocked, send a stable boy at first light." "Yes, Your Grace," the driver called. Amelia tightened her hold on the cloak. "You speak as though I have agreed to go with you." No, Everett said. I speak as though I hope you will. The rain filled the silence between them. In Caldwell House, every silence had been a blade. Here, on the bridge, this one became a space in which she could breathe. Amelia looked past him to the carriage. Its lamps glowed amber through the rain, dim but steady. The open door revealed a dark interior, dry leather seats, and a folded carriage rug. Shelter. Not happiness. Not certainty. Only shelter, and perhaps that was all a person could accept honestly on a night like this. If I enter your carriage, she said, each word careful, there will be talk. A shadow moved through Everett's eyes, not surprise, but recognition of a cruel world's habits. There is already talk. Then this will worsen it. Perhaps. And you are willing to invite scandal for a woman you barely know? Everett's gaze lowered briefly to the road where rainwater streamed around his boots. When he spoke, his voice had changed, becoming not warmer, but older. I once allowed caution to decide what compassion should have decided. Amelia did not understand the meaning, but she heard the grief beneath it. He lifted his eyes again. I have regretted it for years. The wind swept across the bridge, pulling at the edges of the cloak. Amelia felt her strength thinning. Her body wanted warmth. Her heart wanted to collapse somewhere no Caldwell I could watch. Yet her dignity, bruised and stubborn, made one final demand. I will not be hidden, she said. Not like shame. Everett's face became very still. Then he stepped back, giving her the clear path to the carriage before offering his hand only to the air between them. Then you shall enter as my guest, he said, not as my secret. Amelia held his gaze for one long breath. Then, with the rain striking the stones around her and the black road vanishing behind, she walked past him toward the carriage. Everett did not touch her until she placed her gloved hand into his for balance. His grip was firm, brief, and respectful. She stepped inside, gathered the cloak around her soaked gown, and sat with her spine still straight despite the cold. When Everett entered opposite her, he closed the door himself, shutting out the storm's full force. The carriage lurched forward toward Ravenshade Hall, and Amelia watched Greybrook Bridge disappear behind them through the wet glass, understanding with a strange, quiet fear that she had not merely left Caldwell House. She had crossed from one life into another. The carriage climbed away from Greybrook Bridge and into the northern hills, where the road narrowed between black pines and stone fences half-drowned beneath silver sheets of rain. Amelia sat opposite Duke Everett Hawthorne with his cloak wrapped around her shoulders and her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if stillness alone could keep her from understanding how entirely the evening had changed. The interior of the carriage was warmer than the night outside, warmed by thick leather, wool rugs, and the faint glow of a shielded lamp swinging from a brass hook overhead. Yet Amelia could not stop trembling. Some of it was cold. Some of it was exhaustion. Much of it was the terrible silence that follows public humiliation, when the mind begins repeating every word, every face, every small cruelty that could not be answered in time. Everett did not question her. He did not ask whether she had loved Henry Caldwell, or whether her family's debts were as grave as Henry had implied, or whether she understood what people would say when they learned whose carriage had carried her through the storm. He only sat across from her, one gloved hand resting on the head of his cane, his gaze lowered enough to grant her privacy while remaining attentive enough to notice if she faltered. That quiet mercy nearly undid her. If he had been harsh, she could have defended herself. If he had been sentimental, she could have refused him. But this careful respect left her with no enemy to resist. Beyond the rain-streaked window, the lamps caught flashes of wet branches, low stone walls, and water running along the roadside in restless ribbons. Whitmore House is east of Bellwether, she said at last, because the silence had become too gentle and therefore too dangerous. We are not going east. No, Everett replied. The east road is already flooding near the mill. My estate lies north, on higher ground. Ravenshade Hall. She spoke the name before she could stop herself. Everyone in Bellwether knew of it, though few had passed beyond its iron gates. A house built of dark stone on a ridge above Hawthorne Vale, shuttered for much of the year, occupied by a duke who came to town only when obligation dragged him there and left before conversation could warm around him. Children whispered that the hall had more covered portraits than open windows. Women at church said the roses in its garden had not bloomed properly since the death of Miss Rosalind Vale. Men lowered their voices when speaking of the carriage accident that had sealed the Duke's heart away more thoroughly than any locked door. Everett's eyes lifted slightly at the sound of the name. "You have heard unpleasant things." "I have heard human things," Amelia said before caution could restrain her. His expression changed, barely. Not amusement. Not surprise. Something quieter, almost wounded by accuracy. She looked down at her gloves. "Forgive me. I spoke too freely." "You spoke honestly." "That is rarer." The carriage rolled on. Amelia felt the weight of something small against the inner fold of her borrowed cloak, near where her own wet sleeve had pressed against the lining. Her heart gave a sudden, guilty leap. She slid her fingers into the pocket and found the ring. Henry's ring. The one she had placed on the silver tray. For one breath she did not understand how it had come back to her. Then memory returned in fragments, the butler turning away, the drawing-room door opening, her hand reaching blindly as she passed the side table in the hall where the tray had been set down for a moment, her fingers closing around the ring before thought could become shame. She had taken it. Not for love. Not for remembrance. For the blue stone, small though it was. For medicine. For coal. For a doctor's visit her mother had delayed twice because the account had not been paid. The discovery burned through her colder than the rain. Everett noticed the change at once. "Miss Whitmore?" Amelia closed her hand around the ring. "I did something contemptible." "That is a grave word." "It is the correct one." She opened her palm. The ring lay there, gleaming faintly in the carriage lamp, no longer a promise, no longer even an ornament, but evidence of desperation. "I took it back after returning it. I thought if I sold the stone quietly, my mother might have what she needs for the month. Henry would never miss the money, but that does not make it honorable." Everett looked at the ring for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and there was no judgment in his face, only a deepening cold directed elsewhere. "Did Lord Caldwell know of your mother's condition?" Amelia's throat tightened. "Yes." "Did he know the house depended upon the marriage settlement?" "Yes." "And still he sent your carriage away." Her fingers closed again, not from guilt now, but from the effort to remain composed. "Please do not make me hear it plainly." Everett leaned back, his face half shadowed by the moving lamp. "Then I will make others hear it plainly." The carriage turned through a pair of iron gates. Ahead, Ravenshade Hall rose from the ridge, vast and dark against the storm, its windows lit like guarded candles in a house that had forgotten welcome. Amelia stared at it through the wet glass, the ring hidden in her palm, and understood that the night had not finished taking from her. But perhaps, somewhere within those black stone walls, it had begun to return something as well. Ravenshade Hall opened to Amelia not with warmth, but with ceremony. The great doors swung inward before the carriage lamps had fully steadied, revealing a vaulted entrance lined with dark oak, black stone, and candles set high in iron sconces where their flames trembled against the draught. The house seemed less like a home than a memory preserved by discipline, vast, silent, and immaculate, with every polished surface reflecting just enough light to prove how much darkness remained. An elderly butler stood at the threshold in a charcoal coat, his silver hair neat despite the hour, his expression controlled until his eyes moved from the Duke's soaked shoulders to the young woman wrapped in his cloak. The surprise lasted less than a second. "Your Grace," he said, bowing. "Mr. Alden," Everett replied as he stepped down and turned toward Amelia. He did not reach for her at once. He waited until she placed her hand lightly on the carriage frame, then offered his own for balance. The respect in the gesture steadied her more than his grip. Her shoes touched the wet stone beneath the portico, and she lifted her face to the house. Somewhere deep inside, a clock marked the hour with a low, solemn note. Midnight had passed. The old day, with its ring and its ruin, was already gone. "Miss Whitmore is here as my guest," Everett said, his voice carrying into the hall with quiet finality. "She will be given the east guest chamber, a fire, dry clothing, and tea. Send a rider as far as the lower road allows. Her mother must know she is safe." Mr. Alden bowed again, and if he held questions, he buried them beneath training older than curiosity. "At once, Your Grace." Amelia stepped into Ravenshade Hall, and the scent of the place closed around her: beeswax, rain-damp wool, old books, cedarwood, and the faint sweetness of dried flowers long past their season. Her wet skirt whispered against the floor. From the high ceiling, a chandelier hung unlit except for 3 candles, their flames trembling like watchful eyes. Along the grand staircase, portraits lined the wall, most of them uncovered, stern Hawthorne ancestors in dark coats and pale gowns. But in the corridor beyond, Amelia noticed several frames veiled in black cloth. Not stored away. Not removed. Covered, as if grief had not wished to look and had not been strong enough to let go. Everett followed her gaze. For the first time since the bridge, something guarded moved across his face. "The East Gallery is not used often," he said. "You will not be troubled by it." "I am not troubled by quiet things," Amelia answered softly. The words left her before she could measure them. Everett looked at her, but said nothing. A housekeeper arrived moments later, small, brisk, and kind-eyed, introducing herself as Mrs. Vale with a curtsy that held neither judgment nor false warmth. "Come with me, Miss Whitmore. We will have you comfortable directly." Amelia hesitated, the borrowed cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, Henry's ring hidden in her closed hand. Everett saw the movement. "The ring may remain with you tonight," he said quietly, "so no servant would hear. No decision should be made in a storm." Her fingers tightened. "You should think less generously of me." "I think accurately." His answer was calm, and therefore impossible to deflect. Amelia lowered her eyes, because gratitude had become too near to tears, and tears still felt like something Caldwell House might claim if they ever fell. Mrs. Vale led her up the staircase to a chamber facing the valley. The room was prepared quickly, a fire awakened beneath a carved mantel, a copper tub brought near the hearth for warm water, towels laid out, a plain blue dressing gown offered with a tact that made no mention of borrowed garments or ruined silk. Amelia changed behind a screen while rain hammered the windows. When she emerged, wrapped in dry wool, her wet hair loosened over one shoulder, she saw that a tray had been placed near the fire: tea, toast, preserves, and a small bowl of broth. The kindness of it struck harder than insult. She sat, but could not eat. Downstairs, Everett entered his study without removing his gloves. Mr. Alden stood waiting near the desk. "I want every record you can find concerning the Whitmore property, the Caldwell settlement, and any transfer prepared in anticipation of marriage," Everett said. "Tonight, Your Grace?" "Especially tonight." The butler bowed and withdrew. Alone, Everett looked toward the rain-streaked windows. For years, Ravenshade Hall had been a fortress against memory. Now a woman wronged by another man sat beneath his roof, holding a ring she had taken back for love of her mother, and the house felt, for the first time in a very long while, less like a tomb than a threshold. The east guest chamber remained warm long after Mrs. Vale had withdrawn, yet Amelia could not rest. The fire burned low and gold beneath the mantel, the tea on the small table had cooled untouched, and the blue dressing gown folded around her like borrowed calm. Outside, rain moved across the windows in silver streams, hiding the valley, the town, the road home, and every consequence waiting beyond the walls of Ravenshade Hall. She sat in the armchair for nearly an hour with Henry's ring in her palm, turning it once, then stilling it, then turning it again. The blue stone caught the firelight and gave back a cold little spark. It seemed impossible that such a small object could hold so many meanings. A promise that had never been sincere. A public rejection. A month of medicine. A week of coal. A scandal if discovered. A shame if hidden. At last, the room became too full of thoughts, and Amelia rose. She did not intend to wander. She only meant to stand outside the door, to breathe air that had not watched her tremble. The corridor beyond was dim, lit by a single lamp set on a narrow table. The house slept in layers of shadow. Somewhere below, a door closed softly. Somewhere far above, rain tapped at a skylight like fingers asking to be let in. Amelia walked carefully along the carpet runner, her steps soundless, until she reached the beginning of the east gallery. It was colder there. Not neglected, exactly, but preserved in a way that made the air feel untouched. Several portraits hung beneath black veils, their shapes rising along the wall like silent mourners. At the far end, one veil had slipped loose from its upper corner, revealing the pale outline of a painted hand and the edge of a white sleeve. Amelia should have turned back. She knew that. A guest did not enter another person's grief simply because a hallway allowed it. Yet beside the half-covered portrait, a small candle stood on a narrow shelf, its wick drowned in melted wax, its flame gone out. The sight troubled her more than the covered faces. It looked too much like abandonment. She crossed the gallery, lifted the candle, and found a taper still burning near the stair. Shielding the flame with her hand, she brought it back and relit the wick. A fragile light rose before the portrait, touching the edge of the black cloth, the painted sleeve, the curve of a woman's hand that would never grow warm. Amelia lowered her head, not in prayer exactly, but in respect. "Whoever you were," she whispered, "you were loved enough to be mourned badly." Behind her, a breath changed the silence. Amelia turned at once. Duke Everett Hawthorne stood at the entrance of the gallery, still dressed in black, his face unreadable except for the stillness that had overtaken it. She stepped back from the portrait, color rising to her cheeks. "Your Grace, forgive me. I did not mean to intrude." His gaze moved from her face to the candle now burning before the covered frame. For several seconds, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "No one has lit that candle in 4 years." Amelia's shame softened into something quieter. "Then I am sorry it was dark so long." Everett looked at the veil. Her name was Rosalind Vale. The surname struck Amelia gently. Mrs. Vale? Her younger sister. The rain beat against the high windows. The Duke moved no closer, yet the gallery seemed to draw around them, narrowing the world to the candle, the covered portrait, and the grief he had not meant to share. "She died returning to this house," he said. "In weather not unlike tonight." Amelia did not ask for details. Pain offered freely was not a door to be pushed open. She only said, "That is why you followed me." Everett's mouth tightened faintly, not in denial. "Partly. And the other part?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and the answer came with the weight of a confession he had not prepared. "Because you returned a ring as if surrendering everything, and yet you walked out with more dignity than anyone left in that room." Amelia's fingers closed around the ring in her pocket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She felt the strange intimacy of being understood without being explained, and it frightened her more than the storm had. "Dignity does not pay debts," she said softly. "No," Everett replied. "But it reveals who should not be allowed to collect them." Downstairs, far away, the front bell rang once, harsh and unexpected in the sleeping house. Everett turned sharply. Footsteps hurried below. A servant's voice rose, then Mr. Alden's, controlled but urgent. Everett's expression cooled into the dangerous calm she had seen only briefly at Caldwell House. Amelia knew, before anyone came to tell them, that the night had followed her indoors. A moment later, Mr. Alden appeared at the end of the gallery, rain on his sleeves and concern in his eyes. "Your Grace," he said, bowing stiffly. "A messenger from Bellwether has arrived. Rumors have already begun. Lord Caldwell is saying Miss Whitmore left his house willingly in pursuit of your protection." Amelia felt the words strike, not loudly, but deeply enough to steal the warmth from her hands. Everett did not look away from the butler. His voice, when it came, was quiet as the candle beside Rosalind's portrait. "Then at dawn," he said, "we shall make the truth louder than his lie." Morning came to Ravenshade Hall without sunlight. The storm had weakened but not vanished, leaving Hawthorne Vale wrapped in a grey mist that clung to the hills, the roads, and the dark stone walls as if the night had refused to fully release them. Amelia stood before the mirror in the east guest chamber while Mrs. Vale fastened the last button of a borrowed charcoal traveling dress at her throat. The gown was plain, modest, and slightly too long at the hem, but it gave her something the ruined silk from Caldwell House could not, the dignity of not looking like a woman dragged through another family's cruelty. Her hair had been dried and pinned simply. Her gloves were clean. Henry's ring rested inside a small velvet pouch in her hand, heavier than gold had any right to be. Mrs. Vale's reflection watched her in the glass with guarded tenderness. "You do not have to go to Bellwether Church, Miss Whitmore." Amelia looked at the pale oval of her own face and searched for the woman who had walked into Caldwell House the evening before. She seemed very far away now, like a girl seen across water. "Yes," she said. "I do." Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes, then nodded as if she understood that some wounds could not be allowed to heal under a lie. Downstairs, Duke Everett Hawthorne waited in the entrance hall, dressed in black with a dark overcoat folded over one arm. Mr. Alden stood beside him holding a leather case of documents gathered through the night, notes of debt, a draft settlement, correspondence from Caldwell's solicitor, and one quietly devastating memorandum showing that Henry had arranged to secure a portion of Whitmore land before the marriage had taken place. Everett looked up as Amelia descended the staircase. His expression did not soften, but his stillness changed, becoming less like stone and more like attention. "Word has reached your mother," he said. "The lower road was difficult, but Mr. Cole managed it before dawn. She knows you are safe." Amelia closed her eyes for one brief second. Of all the mercies of that morning, that was the one that nearly broke her. "Thank you. She and your sister have gone to church, as usual." "Then Henry expects me there." "He does." Everett paused. "He also expects you to come alone." Amelia's fingers tightened around the velvet pouch. "Then he has misjudged me twice." The carriage ride to Bellwether passed beneath a sky the color of pewter. Water stood in the fields. Broken leaves clung to the roadside. In town, curtains shifted as the Hawthorne carriage rolled past, and faces appeared behind shop windows before vanishing with guilty speed. By the time they reached the white-steepled church at the center of Bellwether, half the congregation had already gathered, and the other half was pretending not to watch the road. Amelia heard the whispers before the carriage door opened. They moved like dry paper despite the damp morning air. Caldwell. Ravenshade. All night. Protection. Ambition. Poor Mrs. Whitmore. Everett stepped down first and turned, offering his hand. Amelia saw the church steps, the open doors, the row of faces turned toward her, and beyond them Henry Caldwell standing near the front walk in a navy coat, composed, grave, beautifully false. Beside him, his mother held a handkerchief as if she had suffered most. Amelia placed her hand in Everett's and stepped from the carriage. The whispers sharpened, then faltered. She did not lean on him longer than necessary. He did not draw attention to his assistance. That, too, was a kind of protection. Inside the church, the air smelled of rain-soaked wool, candle wax, and old hymnals. Her mother sat near the center aisle, pale with worry, Lily beside her with red eyes and clenched hands. Amelia walked to them first. Mrs. Whitmore rose halfway, then stopped herself, one hand pressed to her heart. "Mama," Amelia whispered. "I am here." Her mother touched her cheek with trembling fingers, not asking questions in front of the town, only confirming she was real, safe, unbroken enough to stand. Before Amelia could sit, Henry stepped into the aisle. His voice carried with the practiced sorrow of a man speaking for an audience. "Miss Whitmore, I had hoped to spare your family further discomfort. After last night's unfortunate scene, your decision to seek the Duke's company so publicly has left me no choice but to clarify why our engagement ended." The church became perfectly still. Amelia felt Lily reach for her hand. Everett remained near the rear doors, silent. Henry took another step, mistaking silence for victory. A wife must bring honor into a household. She must bring truth. She must understand restraint. Amelia's face grew cold, not with shame now, but with something steadier. She opened her mouth to answer, but Everett's cane touched the wooden floor once. The sound was not loud. It was final. Every head turned. Duke Hawthorne walked down the aisle without haste, Mr. Alden behind him carrying the leather case. He stopped beside Amelia. Not in front of her, not hiding her, but standing where truth could stand with her. His eyes rested on Henry with such calm contempt that the younger man's color changed. "Lord Caldwell," Everett said, "you have spoken of honor long enough. Now we will discuss documents." Duke Everett Hawthorne did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The hush inside Bellwether Church had become so complete that even the rain dripping from coats in the rear vestibule seemed to pause and listen. Mr. Alden opened the leather case and placed the first document in Everett's gloved hand. Henry Caldwell's expression remained pleasant for 3 seconds, then uncertain for 2, then pale with the first knowledge that the morning would not obey him. "This memorandum," Everett said, holding the page where all could see the Caldwell seal, "was prepared by your solicitor 12 days before last night's dinner. It concerns the transfer of 20 acres belonging to Whitmore House, land that was to be secured under the marriage settlement before the wedding vows were ever spoken." A ripple moved through the pews. Mrs. Caldwell lowered her handkerchief. Amelia stood very still, feeling her mother's fingers tighten around hers. Henry gave a short, strained laugh. "Property arrangements between families are hardly unusual, Your Grace." "No," Everett replied. "But arranging to claim the land, then dissolving the engagement once the documents had been drafted, is not courtship. It is calculation." Mr. Alden handed him another paper. "This letter, written in your own hand, states that Miss Whitmore's family debts were known to you 6 weeks ago, before you placed a ring on her finger. Therefore, your accusation that she deceived you was false." The word false did not echo loudly. It sank. That was worse. Amelia heard someone gasp behind her. Another whisper began and died before becoming language. Henry's composure cracked at the edges. "You have no right to parade private correspondence in a church." Everett's gaze did not move. "You made her shame public. I am making your truth public in the same room." Amelia looked at him then, not as a rescuer, not as a duke, but as a man who understood. That dignity could not be restored by hiding the wound. It had to be defended where it had been attacked. Henry turned toward the congregation, grasping for the sympathy that had so easily served him the night before. "Miss Whitmore left my house and entered His Grace's carriage of her own will. Ask yourselves what sort of woman does such a thing before dawn." Before Everett could answer, Amelia stepped forward. The movement was small, but it carried farther than any shout. She opened the velvet pouch and took out the ring. In the gray morning light, the blue stone looked almost clear, stripped of romance, stripped of power. "This was given to me as a promise," she said. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "Last night, I returned it because the promise had been broken. I took it back because my mother needed medicine, and because I had been left in the rain with no carriage, no settlement, and no protection from the story Lord Caldwell intended to tell." She turned to Henry fully. "That was my shame. Not that I needed help. Not that I accepted shelter. My shame was believing, for even a moment, that your approval could decide my worth." The silence changed. It was no longer hungry. It was listening. Mrs. Whitmore covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Lily stood beside her, no longer hiding behind the pew. Amelia placed the ring on the edge of the nearest bench, between herself and Henry, as if laying down a burden she refused to carry another mile. "I return it for the last time," she said. "Not because you are entitled to it, but because I am not." Henry's face hardened with the humiliation of a man unused to being seen clearly. But there was nowhere left for his charm to stand. The minister, who had watched in grave silence, finally stepped forward and requested that Lord Caldwell leave the aisle. No one protested. Mrs. Caldwell rose with him, her posture rigid, her face as white as the lace at her throat. They passed Amelia without a word. That, too, was a confession. When the church doors closed behind them, the sound was soft, but it felt like a verdict. Everett looked at Amelia. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "your family's immediate debts will be settled through a lawful purchase of the north pasture, at a fair price, if you and your mother consent. No obligation will be attached to my offer. No rumor will be permitted to turn assistance into ownership." Amelia's eyes warmed, but she did not cry. "Not here. Not for them." "Then we will consider it," she said, and there was a faint breath of surprise in the pews because she had not said yes out of gratitude, had not fallen into dependence, had not mistaken kindness for surrender. Everett's mouth softened almost imperceptibly. "As you should." Weeks passed before Bellwether learned how to speak of Amelia Whitmore without lowering its voice. Whitmore House remained standing. Mrs. Whitmore's medicine was paid for. Lily returned to her lessons. The north pasture became part of the Hawthorne estate by proper sale, and the money saved more than a house. It saved a family's winter. As for Amelia, she visited Ravenshade Hall only in daylight at first, always with her mother or sister, always received by Mrs. Vale with tea and by Mr. Alden with the solemn courtesy due an honored guest. In time, the East Gallery changed. The Vales remained, but the candle before Rosalind's portrait was lit each Sunday. Not to trap grief in the house, but to teach it manners. On the first clear afternoon after the storm season ended, Amelia stood beside the restored greenhouse behind Ravenshade Hall, where rainwater still clung to the glass and bright beads and pale roses had begun, impossibly, to bud. Everett walked beside her with his cane in one hand and no urgency in his step. "I did not save you," he said quietly, as if continuing a conversation begun on the bridge. Amelia looked out over Hawthorne Vale, where the road to Bellwether curved through fields washed clean by spring. "No," she said. "You believed me before it was convenient." He turned toward her then, and for the first time his solemn face held something like peace. Amelia did not offer him a promise. He did not ask for one. Some hearts must be approached as old houses are approached, with patience, with reverence, with a light left burning in the window. And if love came, it would not come as rescue, or bargain, or storm. It would come quietly, to two people who had learned that dignity is not what the world gives back after shame, but what the soul keeps holding, even in the rain.